Hello everyone, my name is Robin Ha. I'm the cartoonist of Almost American Girl, a graphic novel memoir, and Cook Korean, a comic book with recipes. I hope everyone is having a great day today and ready to make some comics. So today I wanted to give you a basic overview of what you need to think about when you're making a comic book. And especially when you're making a comic book that's based on your life. So I have to tell you, there's going to be a lot of material. So it could be a little bit overwhelming, but I encourage you to take some notes. And the idea is to get you jump started on your comic book today, which you can finish later in your own time. Okay. And thank you so much for joining my workshop. So what are comics? If you're drawing a picture next to another picture to tell a story, you are making comics. So there's a whole bunch of different styles of comic, different length of comics. You could make a one-page comic, two-page comic, or 300-page long comics. They're all comics. But these days, if it's a book, maybe more than 100-page length of a comic book, some people call it a graphic novel. I want to distinguish between comic books and cartoons. Cartoons are usually a single panel, standalone illustration with words in them, and they're usually to tell a joke or a comment rather than a story. And there are three steps to making comics, whether you're making a diary comics or non-fictional informational comics or superhero comics, it doesn't matter. Every comics takes these three steps to make. And first is writing. Second is thumbnailing slash layout. And third is drawing. And the drawing part can be divided into three big steps. The first will be penciling slash sketching. The second will be inking, and the third is coloring. And coloring can be an optional thing. In Japan and Korea, a lot of people actually make black and white comics, so they will be shading rather than coloring. You could choose to color with Photoshop or some other uh, computer program, or you can choose to color with traditional mediums such as watercolor and markers, but it's all up to you. But generally speaking, you should start with writing or just, taking a note on what your ideas are about. And so we're going to start that first. And since we are making a memoir comic, I want to talk about what makes memoir a memoir. So memoir is a biography written from a personal knowledge, and it can usually focus on either a specific theme or a period of the author's life. So for example, my memoir graphic novel, Almost American Girl, you could say the theme of my book is about immigration and coming of age and also finding a home in a strange land. All of these things can be a theme. So you don't have to just focus on one theme. You could focus on several different themes. And definitely my book is dealing with a specific time period of my life, which is when I was 14, I moved from Seoul, South Korea to Huntsville, Alabama. So you could think about your own life in these two lens. So you could think about what is your obsession. So everyone has an obsession, and I think people who love comics tend to be very obsessed with people, including myself. So my obsession at the time that I talk about in my memoir was comics. I love to read comics. I love to draw them. I love to have conversations with other people about comics. So that was a huge theme in my book. And you could also think about not just a subject, but about people. Like, what are the peoples in your life that you're so in love with, or you hate them so much, or you have a huge crush on them? So, like, these people can be your obsession too. And you want to think about why are you so obsessed with these things or these people, and how they make you who you are. So it could be a comic or baking or playing soccer, etc. There's a whole bunch of different subjects that people can be obsessed with and they spend the most time thinking about and doing. So those can be your theme. And second is you can think about when was the hardest or the most extraordinary time in your life. So my experience of moving from Seoul, South Korea to Huntsville, Alabama was an extraordinary experience that I've never expected to happen in my life. So that was a very easy frame to think about my comic book. It was a very challenging time, so I could focus on how I was dealing with this trauma and challenges and how I was able to get through it. So now I would like you to take 5 to 10 minutes and let's write down your ideas for your comics. All right, now that you have wrote down the ideas for your comics, I want to talk about a few different aspects and elements of comics that you should think about. So first is the character design. Your character design has to be aligned with the tone of your comics. Is your comics funny, serious, sad, or scary? All of these things has to be reflected on your character design. So I want to talk about these few examples here. Here is Alt Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a really extraordinary comic book. It's about his father's time in concentration camp. And he made a really interesting choice to draw people as animals. So he made a choice to draw Jews in Germany as mouse and the uh, Nazi people in Germany as cats and Americans as dogs, Polish people as pigs. So it was like a very interesting choice to make characters that doesn't look like a real people. So in a way that kind of made it a little easier for the readers to uh, get into the story of this really, really traumatic time for a lot of people in the history. And also he didn't make them cute, right? It's a very simplified but also kind of austere looking style that he chose to tell his story, compared to, let's say, CC Bill's El Defo. She also made a choice to draw her characters, so this is also a memoir, as bunnies. So you can tell right away that the audience that she is telling the story to is a little younger than, let's say, the mouse. The color tone, the color scheme is also very sweet and it's pastel-y, very appealing for probably children to teenagers. And the characters are also very sweet and cuddly looking. They're not really intimidating at all. Compared to, let's say, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis. This is also a memoir about the author's life back in Iran before it was taken over by autocratic government. She Her characters are kind of in between, I feel like, Mouse and El Defo. It has the black and white kind of austere tone also, just like Mouse. But the way she drew her face and other characters are kind of cartoony, a little funny sometimes. So it's a little more inviting. And also, she deals with a lot of political events in her stories and a lot of trauma she had, basically leaving her country of birth to France to learn about art. So I highly recommend reading all of these books and kind of see what choices the authors made in order to tell their story the most effective way. And Reina Targelmeyer's Smile, one of my favorite books. You could also see she drew the people as people, but also made some choices to make them look very friendly and goofy. And she kind of exaggerates the facial features a little bit and the expressions. And her color palette is also very friendly and warm. Okay, now when you look at Alison Bechdel's Fun Home here, you can see the characters are drawn in more realistic way, and the color tone is also pretty somber. It's a dark blue, shades of different blues and black. compared to C.C. Bell's El Defo or Reina Telgemeier, which are using very light and fluffy and warm colors. So even though they're all memoirs, because of their subject matter and theme are very different, they use different type of color scheme and different character design. Alex Bechdel's Fun Home is about her family, which actually owned a funeral home. And so it talks about her childhood and her awakening as a lesbian lady, and also dealing with her father, who was also gay, but wasn't out with it at the time when he was alive. So the subject matter is kind of more grown up and also really challenging. There's a lot of sadness and grief in her story. So her character design and the color scheme reflects that. If you look at El Defo, there's multiple different colors here, whereas Alison Bechdel's Fun Home is grayish, a variation of the same tone and black. And the way she drew faces were more realistic compared to, let's say, Persepolis. So these are kind of the choices you have when you are thinking about making your characters. And for those of you who are not really comfortable with drawing, and maybe you're thinking that you're not good enough as an artist and that kind of made you stop from making comics, I want to show you some examples of comics that drawn very simply. And really, you don't need to have a training as an artist to make comics. Whatever works, works. And if your story is good and if it's engaging enough to get the readers to read your comics, that is what is the most important part. So this is Diary of the Wimpy Kid by Jeff Kinney. It's a really funny book. It's not really a comic book. It's kind of illustrated comic uh, book, but you can see he draws people in a very stylized, very simple way, very goofy and funny. And Hyperbole and a Half. This is a really wonderful book, really, really funny. And she chooses to draw these characters, not even as a people, right? But they're just full of expression. They're really funny. And this is by Sanitary Panels. Who cares what guys think? It's a really great Instagram account. I highly recommend you to go check it out. But this person draws all the people as stick figures. So you could make comics with stick figures. Don't let that stop you. And if you still feel so uncomfortable with drawing, you don't really have to draw to make comics. You could even make comics with photos or cutouts of people on top of a photographed background, like you see here in Good Talk, a Memoir and Conversations by Mia Jacobs. I love this book. And she basically took photos of all the background and puts cut out people that she drew, which I think it's very clever idea. It's kind of like playing with a paper doll on, as a kid. But you could do that, or you could not. You don't even have to draw people. You could just take a photo with people in it and put board balloons on top, and that's a comic book. And if you look at Curry Angry here, this is also really cool, really funny Instagram account. She made an avatar of herself in this claymation dolls. So you could do this. I think this is a really, really clever, really cool way to make comics. So she has these props that she made. She made a really small size, and she builds a set for them, and then she placed them and like just takes photos of each panel, and then she draws the comments on probably on Photoshop. So you could explore all these options when you make comics. And comics is such a versatile medium, it even crosses disciplines into fine art. So if you look at Keith Haring here, this is a comic. This is a really, very funny and simple comic, but it's a comic book. You have a panel, you have characters. And if you look at Basquiat here, he also used a lot of picture and word together in his fine art paintings. So sky is your limit, go wild. And I would like to have some time for you to draw your characters right now. All right, now I want to talk about the comic page layout. So there's really no rules how many panels you should have in your page or how little, what angle you need to divide your panels. You could start, I mean, if you think all of this option is too confusing or too many things to think about, you could just have very evenly divided comic pages like you see on the right side here. But what is very interesting about this page, the Immortal Iron Fist number 3, is that he is using the character to lead the reader's eyes. So usually when you have a comic page in Western world, you read from left to right, go to the second tier and then left to right, and then left to right. But on this page, you are actually uh, led by the character to read from left to right and then go straight bottom, right to left, and then to the bottom, left to right. So this is the way you can break rules here too, and in a very interesting way. And a lot of action comics actually use this kind of method to guide readers' eyes. You see it in Spider-Man comics and a lot of the superhero comics. So that's really interesting. And if you look at the Hawkeye here, this David Aja divided the comic panel really in an interesting way. So on the top part, there's 4 small panels. And what it does when you divide panels like that is it actually makes the readers take longer time to scan the same space of the page. So instead of having a long panel here, uh, David decided to make into 4 panels. So it actually slows down when you read these 4 panels instead of the one long panel. And then when you have the third tier here, a big kind of big scene setting panel, it makes reader kind of take a pause and look at all the, little details, all these different figures here. So it actually, when you take a bigger space to make a panel, that makes the reader slow down too. So those are 2 ways that you can kind of control how long somebody will take to read your comics. So you can see all down here, it's a lot smaller panel. And then you can see here on the third page example, Chris Ware's Building Stories. He really uses that panel dividing in a very effective and creative way. So if you are interested in reading kind of artsy comics and see what is possible in terms of laying out your comics, I highly recommend Chris Ware's work. So when this is the same amount of space, almost, compared to the first 2 examples here. But because he divided his panels in such a tiny little squares here, it takes a lot longer for the viewer to actually see what's going on in each panel. So it will take, a few times longer for you to read Chris Ware's page on this third example here compared to the first 2. And then here's another really cool example of how you can divide comics, and you're also following the fall of this character, Flash, from left to right, and then right to left, and then spiral down like that. That's really cool. And here you can also see you don't have to divide your comics in straight lines. You can make curvy lines, whatever works best for your storytelling. And if you look at the ping pong on the right side, he divided the panels in a very angular, sharp, thin panels here, it kind of makes you feel the force and the fastness of the ping pong ball flying across the table. I mean, look at all this really jagged panel layouts. And on the Sandman here, he used the panel divider in a really interesting way. It kind of dissolves into this very dreamy, very unconventional way to tell the story here. And it's kind of blending into the illustration itself. So you don't have to have a panel that's just like a white border. You could actually incorporate the drawing into becoming a panel too. And on the right side here, Young Avengers, this is really cool. So it's kind of playing a little joke here on the panel and the comics as a form of storytelling. So these characters are they're escaping the panel to escape whatever problems they're dealing with, and they're just walking outside of their panel into the gutter, and then they're rescuing other people. So this is a very cool tongue-in-cheek way of exploring comics medium to tell a really exciting and fun story. And also, there's really no rules. You don't have to have a panel border to make a comic book. You can just draw a series of illustrations next to each other in a general direction that people are supposed to read comics. So there's two examples here where you are telling a story in comics form without a panel border. And it totally works. And another aspect of comics is speech bubbles and thought bubbles and sound effects. So these are very functional elements in comics, but it can also be a tool for you to make your comics even more creative and unique. So instead of just having a uniform ellipsis kind of balloon for speech bubble, you could actually make these jaggedy edges or wobbly thin edges. All of these kind of signals the viewers what the tone of the voice when they're speaking these words, and even the characteristic of the character. So when you look at the first one, this is more like hi. It's like shouting, right? And then the next here is more like hi. It's very wobbly and wimpy. And then even more so, these dotted line actually indicates whispering in comics. So it's like hi. And then this is like hi. So you can kind of feel like there's these are saying all the same word hi, but it's not the same voice, right? And like if you look at the bottom here, it's more like multiple people are all saying hi, because you see the tails here, there are three of them instead of one. And this is the thought bubble. If these kind of lines are usually used like when it's like a supernatural story and like the voice is being heard in their head instead of being spoken, something like that. And sound effects can be also really cool, very fun way to explore different styles in your comics. And if you want to look at more like a traditional examples of sound effects, how they're used in comics, I highly recommend checking Betty and Veronica by Dan DiCarlo. I mean, look at this. It's a really cool elements. It makes it serves a function as a sound effect, but it's also really cool visual elements in these scenes. And here are some really, really creative way of using speech bubbles. So A Serious Poet by David Mazzucchelli is one of my favorite book, and this book really uses different elements of comics in a very creative way. And what he chose to do is give different speech bubble shape and fonts per character. So these four women are speaking in a very different voice, which is true to life, right? Nobody speaks the same way in the world. We all have different voices. We all have different characters and personalities. So these speech bubbles reflect the character's personality. And the Sandman here, Sandman is also a really great series to check out. And this is a conversation between Dream and Delirium. And you can tell just by how the characters are drawn and also by their speech bubble what kind of characters they are. So Dream and Delirium, you can tell, like, even if you have never read this comic book, you can just look at how their speech bubble look like to determine which one is Delirium, which one is Dream. The Dream's speech bubble is kind of mysterious and kind of gloomy and austere. Compared to Delirium, she's kind of silly and a little crazy and even little childlike. You can see her font is kind of wobbly and it gets bigger and smaller. So you can really hear her voice by reading, looking at these speech bubbles. And here's another cool thing about comics is that you can show when people are speaking in foreign language. So this here, American Born Chinese by Jin Lin Yang, there are characters who are speaking in Chinese and there are characters who are speaking in English. So this is kind of like a more traditional way of indicating somebody speaking in foreign language. Usually you put these little parentheses around the words and then have a little asterisk here. And then you'll say like a note down bottom here saying translated from Mandarin Chinese. So that's how you can indicate foreign language. And what I did in my book is actually I made Korean letters to be blue and English to be black. So you don't have to do it in every scene when there's a foreign language spoken. You could just do it when it first happens, the very first page that the foreign language is happening. You can make an indication there. And then that should be a signal for the readers to recognize when they see it again and then another page, they would recognize, oh, that is Korean and that's English. And also I made a choice to write scribbles instead of typing the letters when somebody's speaking in English that I don't understand. So there's a really cool ways that you can, use the comics element to tell this different type of situation happening with a visual cue. Okay. And the next important thing that you have to think about before you do any layout is you have to decide on the format and the size of your comics. So the best format of your comics really depend on your personal taste and what type of story you're telling. If you want your comics to be read mainly on a digital format, let's say like on Instagram or Tumblr, usually square format is the most powerful practical format for your comics, because just let's say Instagram or Twitter, the format that they are given is the square format. Whereas the traditional superhero American comics, they're a much longer rectangle format. So those are something you have to consider. And also, if you're printing your comics, you want to decide on the margins of your comics page. So if you're printing, you have to have some trims around the page for when the printer makes the book. They usually put the books together and then they trim the size to make it like flat. So you have to have enough extra space around your pen pages, so the important part doesn't get cut off. So once you have decided on your format and the size of your comics, now you can begin to make thumbnails for your comics. So thumbnailing is probably the most creatively challenging and probably the most important part of making your comics. And that's what really makes comic what it is. um, and there's many different ways to go about it. Some of my colleagues, they actually make thumbnails as they write. I actually don't do that. I write down what's happening, just as a prose, and then I take that and I turn that into thumbnail. So it all depends on what works best for you. um, so what I did here, if you look at it, I just basically wrote down what is happening in that page or in that chapter, and then I circled the sentences or two that I think will fit into a panel. So it kind of gives me an idea of like how many panels, how many pages I need to make in order to tell this part of the story. And once I've done that, I then make it into a very rough, small sketch of the page. So this is kind of like a blueprint, like for architects. It's you're building a very broad skeleton of how you want to tell the story in comics. And it's all personal taste. You can take note right next to your thumbnails, or you could even shade your thumbnails to see like how it would look like, how many parts are blue, black or dark, and how many parts or panels are light. So you can spend as long or short as you want in this process. But one thing you have to make sure is to don't be so attached to your first thumbnail. A lot of times you have to make 2, 3, 4 different versions of the same passage, uh, just to kind of get the rhythm and the pacing right. And there's a million different ways to tell a story. So this is the time you really have to explore and take time to settle on one specific uh, layout before you go on to the final stage, which is the drawing. So a lot of people who just starting out as a cartoonist, they don't realize how much planning actually takes place before you draw. And a lot of people just think about drawing when they want to be a cartoonist. I learned it hard way. Drawing is actually probably the least I mean, it is time consuming, but like least energy spending in a way, because you have to make sure your story and your layout is rock solid before you start drawing. You don't want to be going back and forth when you're in your final stage, making all these changes in your storyline. I mean, that will be just a huge waste of space. So I really highly recommend you to spend enough time in the development stage of writing stories and thumbnailing before you go on to the drawing stage. And when you're making these layouts, I would highly recommend to show the actions rather than telling it in a caption. So for example, instead of writing, I was drinking tea and reading a book, then I realized how late I was to my meeting. You can just draw it without ever saying a word. And if you have to use caption, you have to make sure the information in your caption is not drawn in the same panel, because that will be just redundant and it's completely unnecessary. So if you have to have a caption, it should be about the information that is not told in your drawing. Okay, now I would like you to spend 5 to 10 minutes making thumbnails of your story. Now I would like to talk about comics script. This part is not really necessary if you're the author, the writer, and the illustrator of your comics. I don't do scripting for my own comics, but if you want to work with another writer or another illustrator, this script is pretty necessary because you want to be able to express like what your story is going to be like and what the captions and the word balloons are going to be like in a really clear way. um, so here's an example of a comic script that I got from Lisa Yi, and this is the final the comic page that I drew from her script. And the script can be as descriptive and as simple as you like. As an artist who have worked with other writers, I would recommend not being too descriptive in your comic script. It should have enough information that is important in your story, but you really don't have to go into too much detail about like what people are wearing and what the backgrounds are like, unless it's very, very crucial to your story. And usually the script will be like page one, panel one, and the caption, and then some description of like what is going on in the panel. And if there's dialogue, you should say the dialogue. And then you go panel one, and then panel two, panel three, things like that. Okay, finally, we're in the drawing comics page stage. So like I told you in earlier, there's three big steps in drawing your final page. First is penciling, second is inking, and third is coloring. And this three steps is for whatever mediums you're using, including a digital medium. A lot of times these days, the professional artists would draw everything start to finish on a digital platform. There are several different applications you can use to make comics. A lot of people use Photoshop and Illustrator. A lot of people use Clip Studio Paint, which is a Japanese program for comics. All of these are totally fine. You could use those if you have access to them, or you could just draw in an old-fashioned way with paper and pen. That's how I started to make comics. But now I do most of my work digitally. And there are 7 steps in drawing a comic page. I would like you to start with dividing the panels. If they're straight, then definitely use rulers. And then once you have divided these panels, I want you to ink them first. So once that's out of the way, you can easily, make sketches with pencil and erase them if you need to without having to redraw panels all the time. So draw the panels, ink the panels first, and then you can do a very rough sketch. What I mean by really rough sketch is that don't draw face like with eyes and nose and all the hair. Don't do that at this stage. Just make space for what things are gonna be placed in your panel. So make space for people and backgrounds, and really important, make space for your speech bubbles and thought bubbles and captions. Words takes up a lot of space in your page, a lot more than you expect. So when you draw these rough sketches of word balloons, actually write the letters that's going to go in the word balloon, and make sure that the word balloon is big enough to contain all those words. And once you have done that, then you can refine your sketch, still using pencil. And you can go ahead and put, faces and all the details. And you can be as rough as you want. I don't spend too much time drawing pencil lines because these days I use digital tools, so it's a lot easier to erase things. But if you're doing it in a traditional medium using pen and ink, I recommend spending enough time in your pencil stage. So when you go to the inking stage, you don't have to worry too much about fixing things, because it's a lot harder to erase ink line than a pencil line. So draw all the details, and once you're happy with that, then I actually recommend inking the word balloons and letters first, because these things kind of have to be neat. It has to serve a very specific function. So, and it's also a good way to kind of get used to using pens. It's a little less intimidating to ink the word balloons and letters compared to, like, let's say your character's faces. So it's a good way to kind of get warmed up. So I'll do the inking of letters and word balloons first, and then I'll ink the rest of the panel and every panel in the page. And then once that's done, I would recommend you to wait at least 10-15 minutes just to make sure your ink lines are dry. I've made many mistakes as a young drawer to just go ahead and like start erasing my ink line, and then I'll smear the entire page and I'll be really upset about it. So please make sure your inks are all completely dry, and then you can erase all the pencil lines. And then the last step will be if you choose to color your comics, and then you can color the comics or you can shade them. And I really want to make sure that you use waterproof inks, especially if you're gonna use watercolor to color your comics. And here are some drawing materials for comics. You really don't have to use a super expensive paper or inking tools. I mean, I use all kinds of office supplies to ink my comics. Like Sharpies are great. They're waterproof. There are a lot of writing pens that you can use for your drawings also. These are some really good quality, inexpensive papers that I recommend. Strathmore is a really good brand to start using, especially for watercolor. And Bristol board. Bristol board are really smooth compared to watercolor, and it's a great thick paper to use inks on. And if you want to use a notebook, make sure the papers are pretty thick. Don't use just a regular sketchbook paper to draw comics. You want your paper to be thick and strong enough that it can withstand all the erasing and inking wet medium. And these are some pencils and erasers and rulers you can use. I highly recommend you to use kneaded eraser here. It kind of feels like a Play-Doh, and you can erase a huge part of your page without damaging it too much. So like these hard erasers are great too, but if you have made a lot of mistake when you're doing penciling, using this kind of eraser can be kind of damaging for the paper. So when you pencil your comic page, I would recommend you to use HB or 2B. So it's pretty soft pencil lead, but not too dark. So 4B, 6B, those pencil leads are great for illustration or making fine art, figure drawing studies and things like that. But for comics, they're way too dark and it'll be really hard for you to erase them cleanly. So HB, which is the regular writing pencil, those are great for sketching for comics. And here are some inking tools. These are some of the inks that I really recommend. So Big's writing pen is great. They're waterproof. Sharpies are great. If you want to use a little bit finer, more fine artsy pen tool, I highly recommend Faber-Castell. These are really, really dark jet black color pen, which is great. And you can also use brush to ink your lines. I love using brushes to ink because that gives you a lot of option in thick and thinness of the lines. You can make kind of like, you know, messy lines, and it gives you a lot more variety, but it can be a little bit intimidating for a beginner to use. So if you want to go ahead and use brushes, I recommend having a scrap of paper next to your comic page. So once you first dip the ink in on your brush, you want to kind of do a trial run first on the scrap paper next to you to make sure that the tip of your brushes are sharp and all pointed before you go out onto your final. And I recommend also trying using these fountain pens. So these are kind of popular in Asia, Japan, and Korea. A lot of manga artists use them. And these pen nibs can come off. So some of them are really thin. It makes a really thin, uniform line. Some of them are kind of more voluptuous, and when you press them, it can make a thick line too. So experiment with different tools for inking, and you just have to find the one that works best for you. And here are some coloring mediums. These markers are great. I guess the most kind of popular brand is Copics, which is a Japanese marker. They're really beautiful markers, but they can be pretty expensive. Um, so I actually don't recommend using marker too much because they can be really costly, and they don't last long. You have to kind of use them when you get them. If you buy them because they're really cool, and then you feel like you can't use them because they're so expensive, and like years pass away, then the marker will be dry. So it's like, if you get them, you should use them right away. And the watercolor is a great tool to color your comics, and color pencils are also great. Um, I don't really recommend you to use things like pastel or charcoals because they can be really messy. You can, I mean, I don't want to stop you from using them, but just make sure that you use fixative after you use them so they don't move around on your page. So lastly, I would like to give you some tips for people who are just starting out in comics. First, please start small and learn to finish your comics. So you might have this grand idea for your comics that's going to be like 300-page long, 500-page long comics. Those are great ideas, but they're not really suited for a beginner. Making comics and finishing them takes a lot longer and a lot more energy than you can expect. So please start with, let's say, 2-page comics, 4-page comics, and then learn to finish them. And that's a great thing for you to actually take to a convention, or you can put it up on online resource, Instagram or Twitter, so you can actually share those comics that you finish. Whereas if you're working on some really long comics for the first time, you may never be able to share that for months and months and months, even years. And chances are your style might change when you work on such a long project, and especially if you're a young new artist. In the middle of the way, after 50-page in, you might realize, oh my goodness, my character looks totally different now from when it started. Then you'd have to go back and change things. So those long projects should be dealt with when you're a little more experienced and when you have a style that you can actually reproduce in every page. Second, read as many comics as you can. Your best teachers are going to be the comic books that's already out there. And please read voraciously. Don't just read one type of comics. Like, let's say you just love superhero comics and you want to just read that. That's great, but you should also read other type of comics. Just have a broader palette, broader taste that you can choose from. And third is, if you're stuck writing or drawing your comics, don't worry, it happens to every one of us. My recommendation is just to take a break. It's much better than to sit and just stare at this page that just doesn't come out right and pound your head against your drawing board. That's not going to help you to figure it out. It's much better if you just take a break, go for a walk, play with your friends. You can read a book that you really like or watch a movie. All of these things are going to just kind of make you more relaxed about it. And that state of mind will actually help you to figure out what to do next. And fourth is probably the most important thing, is to have fun with your comics. And don't be shy to share your comics with your friends and family. If you want to be a professional cartoonist, sooner or later, you would have to show your work to somebody. And the sooner you get experience with showing it to people and getting their feedback, the better off you will be. All right, so that's it for now. I hope you found this workshop useful, and please don't give up on your dream and keep working on your comics. And if you like to check out more of my work and more of my tips about making comics, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Robin Ha Art. Thank you, everyone. Bye.